I'm John Fingleton, and I've just chaired a nuclear regulatory task force. So I was approached in February and asked would I be willing to do this. If you'd asked me in February, before I got a call from, it was a Ministry of Defence actually, called me, what I thought about nuclear, I wouldn't have had any strong view. I would have said, I haven't thought about it very much. I had lots of other things going on. I knew a lot about regulation. Our job was basically to look at the system and work out why everything took so long and was so expensive. And they also said they wanted radical proposals. They didn't want a minor tweaking of things. There's lots of people out there who just say, oh, everything's overregulated and sweep it away. I would describe it as a sort of radical fine-tuning. So saying like, where is it really harmful? There are many more people in the system who can say no or block something than can say yes. It's very difficult for somebody to say yes and something to go ahead, but there's a lot of people with the ability to say no. And secondly, each government department has its own local priorities and their own issues that are important to them. So when you're trying to push a cross-government reform that affects a whole lot of departments, that's quite a big challenge because each department is going to follow its own priorities. And so that needs a strong drive from the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, who I think can say to ministers, this needs to happen, it needs to happen quickly. In this case, you have Energy Department, which leads on most of the policy in this area, the MOD, which does all of the nuclear deterrent, but then you have the Ministry of Justice, who looks after all the rules about judicial review, etc., international treaties. You have the Ministry of Communities and Local Government, which looks after the planning system. You have DEFRA, which looks after the environment. You have DWP, which looks after health and safety. Arguably, you then have maybe the next layer out, you have the Business Department, which looks after inward investment and trade, and is trying to negotiate deals with the Americans on bringing in more nuclear. And then you have, for example, DSIT, which is looking at the underlying science and technology, whether it's further out with fission or quantum and AI. So you have a lot of different government departments with a stake in it. And if you want to really drive top-down reform, you have to have strong political leadership at the top. The other problem we have with a lot of regulation is risk aversion, is that ministers will say, I want to say to regulators, they'll say to other people, I want you to take risk. But then the moment they say, well, we're going to take this particular risk, they say, well, I'm not sure that's the one I would be happy to support. It's quite difficult because politicians they're the ones that have to face the public, and it's difficult for them. So I think the more that the centre of government can do in terms of articulating the benefits and saying why it's important and driving it forward is really important.
But you've just identified so many different departments that need to get a handle on this.
Yes.
Starmer himself can't obviously control it. You talk about in the report the need for a commission for nuclear regulation. But I mean, don't you need a sort of nuclear czar driving this all through across all these departments? What's the system that can come into place that will get everyone to wake up?
Normally, I think the Treasury has a lot of ability to push these things through because it controls the purse strings and it has the ability really to drive a lot of this change forward. And the Treasury has been enormously supportive and wants this to happen. And the Treasury, of course, is paying the bill for the nuclear deterrent, and the Treasury is at least paying some of the bill for other parts of like the decommissioning bill, is all taxpayer funded essentially. And some of the new build nuclear is also Treasury matter. The Treasury also has an arm that's concerned with productivity growth. If we can bring down the cost of energy, the cost of living, all of that, it drives competitiveness. So the Treasury has a big incentive for this to happen, and it has a lot of the levers to make government departments do stuff. I mean, I'm not an expert in the university government. The number 10 has the ability to set direction and provide vision.
Let's explain what has actually happened. How do we get here? The UK, as some will know, was the first country to develop a civil nuclear reactor with Cowder Hall in '56. How do we go from that point? There's an amazing stat in your report where you say by 1965 we had more nuclear power stations than the US, USSR and France combined.
Yeah.
So given that first decade of progress, what's the story since then?
So on that first decade of progress, we made a lot of progress. We did build things quickly. We didn't always build things safely. So there's a very good account in one of the books I read about a near miss at Sizewell, which had a different name then. um, at Sellafield, which had a different name then. And we also, with the Magnox reactors, we had 11 of them, I think. Each one was different. Each one had different fuel. So we left a big decommissioning legacy. So arguably, we deferred a lot of the costs, and we did speed. And I don't think that's an acceptable way to do things anymore. And so that happened in the 70s and 80s. I think because of nuclear proliferation, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, all of these things built up a sense of this is unsafe, this is more dangerous. Fukushima more recently just led to a period in which the UK stopped doing nuclear at the rate it had been doing it before.
But that's almost, a series of unfortunate accidents was the sole culprit. But when there are other causes behind the decline of our nuclear?
I mean, the regulatory thing has probably crept in more in the last 20, 30 years. There would have been some big regulatory things coming from non-proliferation. An awful lot of the problem if you go back and read about what happened in the 80s and 90s, a lot of the problem was inconsistent government decision making about what they wanted to do. And you read what happens in the 80s and 90s, and you read, a story not uncommon with today, that something's drifting, the government is committed to do something, then there's a change in policy, then they have to start all over again, then a new minister comes in, gets a grip, and then they're gone and somebody else comes in and has to start looking at it again. And there are ministers like Tim Egger in the 1990s, a Conservative energy minister, who made huge strides on trying to progress it, and then 2 years later it still hadn't moved. And I think it was in the book, one of the books I read, there's a big piece on how actually it was in 2005, 2007, the third new Labour administration, that actually David King, who was the government's chief scientific advisor, Sue Eon, who was on the committee with me, played a really important role in persuading Tony Blair that we had to re-embrace nuclear. And that's when the shift came, was in about 2006, 2007. And it was a big change at the time. I mean, you're probably not old enough to remember that, but I mean, I don't particularly. I mean, I remember it happening, but I didn't study it closely. But when I went back and read about it, you could see that actually that was the first time a prime minister grabbed the issue in about 20 years and said, we're going to do this, and we're going to, and that did lead to. That's why we have Hinkley Point C being built. And so there's a long lead time with these things, but that was where the reignition of nuclear began, I think, back in that period.
But a lot of people will read your report, and you outlined some of the great advantages of nuclear, from obviously the emissions picture with net zero, to these being good jobs, national security element, the grid stability, and wonder how on earth it is that nuclear power generation peaked in 1998 when I was 6. And you give credit to Blair for reviving it 10 years later, but what happened to the debate in the 90s that we got to the point where we were happy to just see that curve come down, just as global warming became an issue?
I mean, I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I've read a bit about it, but I haven't gone back to try and understand all of that. I really try to focus on today and where the regulation's at today. Yeah. But I do think that one of the things we sort of allude to in the report is, consistent government policy is really important in this space. Having a fleet approach is really important, because that's a lesson from history, is that having 11 different Magnox reactors isn't just a problem for decommissioning and created the decommissioning legacy, but it's also a problem for regulation, because if you've got 11 identical reactors, regulating them is easier than if you've got 11 different ones. So we need to get better at replicating things, so that makes the regulation a lot easier. The regulation also interacts with other aspects of it as well. So it covers a whole range of areas.
I don't know if this is a particularly useful thing to show you. You'll have seen it before, but this is electricity production in France. And they obviously took a series of decisions, I think really in the 70s, to get themselves to a position where they now produce 70% of their energy from nuclear. Did you guys look at all the way they do things?
They have a big installed base. But the reactor at Flamanville, which is the same as the reactor at Hinkley Point, has had quite a lot of similar regulatory issues to the ones we have. So
this is actually a legacy of...
So this is a legacy of good decisions made on infrastructure in France in the 70s, 80s, 90s.
They're now facing the same problems.
But I think they have some of the same problems. Now, they're still cheaper than us in building these things. But I think some of these issues about regulation. And so, for example, post 9/11, all new reactors in the world underwent a requirement to have much stronger external casing to protect against an aircraft going into them. That was a risk that materialized in 2001 in the aviation terrorism, whatever you call it, but completely unrelated to nuclear. But suddenly nuclear had a much bigger regulatory expense associated with protection from aircraft flying into them as a potential instrument of terrorism. And then Fukushima happens, and although nobody died from radiation in Fukushima, and the reactor, increasingly the reactors are passive, safe by design, etc. But one of the things that came out of that was that you need backup diesel generators or backup generators to get power to a power station in the event of something like a tsunami. And so, each of these events that materializes, whether in nuclear or in another area, brings forward a need for another risk that we need to mitigate in a different way. I think one of the interesting things is when you put all those together, it adds up to quite a lot. So, yeah, that makes nuclear expensive. It's one of the reasons why, you talk about whether the bill is for Hinkley is 36 billion. We're not going to get it down to like 5 billion or 10 billion. It's still going to be an expensive project because you need it to be safe. But the way we go about doing it is still excessive. So there's a happy ground in between those two.
We're talking of international because this is another comparison point. And the cost of Hinkley.
Yeah.
Why are others, especially in Asia, able to get the cost so much lower than us?
So I think, for example, in China and South Korea, they are building a lot of the same reactors very quickly. They have very different health and safety regimes, very different environmental protection regimes than we have. Well, I think in China the environmental protections are going to be there's a much more top-down approach in China. Now, I think we could have a more top-down approach by our government. I didn't put it in the report, but I sometimes talk about the need for something that feels slightly more like benevolent dictatorship from government, as opposed to consultation, taking long times, running processes. If you really know what you want to do, sometimes the government should say, we're going to build this number of reactors and we're going to build them in these places and we're just going to get on with it, as opposed to slightly letting that decision emerge from a whole set of processes. And I think that in China, South Korea has a very good record on infrastructure investment, whether it's broadband, other things as well. So some of these countries have a much stronger system of top-down government direction of what they're doing, and they have very different regulatory frameworks. So I think it's easier to compare the UK with, for example, European Union countries, where we essentially have very similar environmental protection.
But what's the problem with their protections? Why don't we just have regulatory framework that's more like those in Asia?
So
why be European?
Well, we have a trade and cooperation agreement with the European Union, and
which limits us.
And that limits us because in order for us to trade with the European Union, they want to know that we are not having some sort of regulatory race to the bottom that gives our companies a competitive advantage vis-a-vis the European Union. And that was one of the things we had to be mindful of, is that's a constraint, and the government won't want to upset trade with the European Union because of this. You can imagine, and it's quite theoretical, an argument that says that if Britain has a race to the bottom on environmental standards that gives us cheaper energy and gives UK companies a competitive advantage. Now, it's a fairly tenuous argument, but what we see is that other countries in Europe, like Finland, in nuclear, and Spain in other infrastructure and so on, are able to build stuff far faster and better than we are. And they approach compliance with the Habitats Directive, they approach large planning projects in a very different way than we do. And so we did look at what was done in other countries. And then we also looked at countries like Canada, which has a an exemplary safety record, but also a history of nuclear, to understand the various, the best practice internationally on some of this stuff.
The report has 47 recommendations, but I mean, if you were just trying to distill this for someone who's just coming to this, talking about all those comparisons and given the framework we're in, what are the 3 things you'd focus on that we should change, if you can distill it to 3? So
I think one of them is in the area of nuclear safety standards, where we have a principle called as low as reasonably practical in our health and safety regime.
ALARP, is that
ALARP is what it's called. And we have a similar one in the environmental side called ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable. And it's a not dissimilar framework that exists everywhere else. And what has happened with that, with our nuclear safety standards, is that it acts like a ratchet. And we just keep getting it tighter and tighter. So the analogy I've used for that is you drive at 70 miles an hour on the motorway, and that's a balance between safety. There's some risk still, some accidents that happen on the motorway. They're quite rare. Motorways are very safe, but occasionally there are accidents. But you might have the following argument: well, 60 miles an hour would be more safe. So let's go to 60 miles an hour. But at 60 miles an hour, you can then make the argument 50 would be more safe. And by logic, you get down and eventually you're at 5 miles an hour and you think this is quite safe. And it might still have accidents, but now the accidents are going to be people getting caught between stationary cars rather than going too fast. But you've lost sight of what the purpose of the motorway was. And a little bit of the nuclear safety thing has lost sight of the purpose of this is actually to deliver energy. And if you get to 1/10 or 1/100th of the exposure to millisieverts, which is how we measure this, you've gone too far. And our standards in some areas are between 10 times and 100 times stricter than international standards, and a lot stricter than, for example, we have in medical and radiological applications. And we've suggested that as a matter of top priority, the government revises that, because that's going to really matter for the building of the Rolls-Royce reactors, but it also matters for a whole lot of ongoing things like decommissioning, how easy it is to get work done on these sites and so on.
How did that happen? Which part of the system, was it the courts, civil servants, quangos, MPs, ministers, allowed ALARP to be sort of curdled as a once noble idea and become a ratchet?
So I think one of the reasons why it becomes a ratchet, so we talk about this in the report, is businesses are as responsible for this as the regulators. So what happens is companies, you imagine there's a line, a regulatory line, and you think beyond that line, it's too unsafe for the benefit, and below that line, actually it's safe and the cost of doing something is disproportionate for the benefit you get, okay, when you do a risk-return analysis. And you have that line. Now, there's a grey area around that line. And what the companies do is they think, we want to go well below that grey area. And let's do something that's like super safe. Because that way, the regulator won't question it. We're not anywhere near the line. And they worry that if they try to go and have an argument with the regulator about the line, they worry about 2 things. They worry that it'll delay the project because the regulator will be difficult. And they also worry that their reputation with the regulator for safety might be questioned because the regulator thinks these guys are pushing too much. You also have, in addition to that, a problem that individual inspectors can make decisions that are overly stringent, that would not be the ones that their bosses make, but you can't escalate everything. And then companies, if they feel they want to escalate something,
risk blowback.
Yeah, risk blowback, and risk the inspector then thinking, well, I don't like the fact that you've done this. And we certainly heard 1 or 2 examples where people were threatened with, if you do this, there's other ways I can be tough on you. But so we need a different equilibrium. We need an equilibrium in which companies push to the line much more,
and they're rewarded for it.
And the regulators create a system in which that happens. So the recommendations to give effect to that are several. So one is this one-stop shop commission that makes the decisions, in which you get more escalation. So there's a contentious issue, it just goes to the commission, they make a decision. That's one stop. We've also built in a challenge function inside the regulators, each of the regulators, that basically somebody inside the regulators on big projects should be tasked with trying to ask the question, have we gone too far here, as opposed to are we going far enough?
On safety?
Yeah, on safety, but also on environmental, we've said for the environmental regulators as well. So that you build in that challenge. We've also said that the Chancellor should write to the chairs of a lot of these, all of the big companies and the supply chain, asking them what they're doing to address the culture of risk aversion within their businesses. And we need to get better at understanding this. I'll give you a completely different example, anecdotal, but like as I was writing this up, there was a very windy weekend at the beginning of October, and the Royal Parks all closed because of the wind. And I sort of thought, well, that's quite odd. And they closed because they didn't want people to get hit by trees. And then I asked somebody senior in the health and safety executive, is this your guidance? And they said, actually, we get quite frustrated by this because people think we, the regulator, have told them to close the parks. Well, we haven't told them to close the parks. They're deciding to do that. So there's something odd about our...
Someone at a low level who runs the park.
Well, or there's something about the risk aversion stroke exposure to liability that makes companies quite cautious these days.
Or even public institutions.
Or public institutions. Well, this is Royal Parks, but it complies. But you get a lot of caution and a lot of risk aversion. And it's not always driven by the regulator.
Yeah.
The regulator in the background might be saying, but we've said to the companies, you should make that assessment.
But that's a great example, right? Because what's happened there is an infinitesimally low risk tree fells someone has become a reason to stop anyone using a park for that weekend.
Well, yeah, but it was also funny because the reason I noticed this because I wasn't myself walking in the park, but I cycle a lot, and I was cycling back into London. And so there were crowds of people walking around the edge of the park. And so all I was thinking was, well, at the edge of the park is where there's a road and there's a gap. And so if trees are going to fall over, they could fall over easily on the edge of the park. So I wasn't sure that the risk had really been so reduced as just moved. Right. So, holistically, you're asking yourself the question, how proportionate is this, et cetera, et cetera. It's anecdotal. It's probably a very bad example. And somebody will criticize me for using it. But I just give it as an example. I'm trying to give it as an example because I think...
Well, it's one people can understand.
Yeah, because you sort of go like, is that where we want to be as a society, that we close parks when there's wind? And, you've had these examples with children's playgrounds or whatever it is, that we become so risk averse that we don't allow people to... I've done a lot of work in consumer protection over my life. In financial services, the argument is made, we've become so risk averse about protecting the consumer in financial services that the financial ombudsman scheme rewards consumers even when they've been very stupid. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if you take rail, if the train is late by 5 minutes, the train companies don't compensate me. But if I'm late by 5 minutes, they make me buy a new ticket for £100. Mm-hmm. The risk is transferred to the consumer. So I think we don't always get in regulation. We don't get this who bears the risk thing right. But in nuclear, it's a good example where the problem is not just the regulator. It's a problem of risk aversion by the companies, combining with maybe lack of regulatory clarity. As one person put it to me, the regulator won't always say what good is, but if the company comes to them with something to say, well, this is not good enough. So we just need a better dialogue between regulators and businesses to get closer to the right answer on a lot of these
But
issues.
people will hear better dialogue and they'll say, I don't know, John, that sounds pretty vague. Like, you're so clear about what needs to happen. How can we sort of force through something?
Do you have a better idea how we do that?
No, I'm not the expert, but
other people have said,
how can we force through change?
Other suggestions. So people made the following suggestion: is that the regulator should have a growth duty.
Yeah.
I quite like the idea that the regulator has got one top job, which is to keep us safe, right. and we do that. But I also quite like the idea that there's pushback against the regulator on that, and so that's the purpose of this commission, is to make sure that these issues get debated and get teased out properly in a more transparent way.
But can I give you an example though? Why that sounds good is that it's a bit like the Fed, right? It has two duties: to maintain price stability and also to prevent unemployment. So it can't, if it was just directed in one way, it would only do the one. And it sounds like the regulator without this growth duty is only...
So we have said that
one direction.
the Commission's primary duty should be protecting safety, and then it should have secondary duties
Right.
around promoting innovation, et cetera, et cetera. So
But not a dual mandate.
But no, because I think that's a decision for politicians. I think
Right.
if there's a big high-level trade-off between... I think if you have a regulator who has a task of promoting... I mean, I'd probably disagree with the Chancellor on this as well, but I think if you're a regulator whose job it is to keep us safe, if they have a competing mandate, which is to have economic growth, and there's a trade-off between safety standards and economic growth, the public is going to want to know where that's made. And I think that needs to be made politically. That's why we've suggested it should be the government revising the dose limits for nuclear.
Right.
It's a government decision where that risk-return trade-off is.
Can we just talk about some of the stuff that gets people most riled up about this? Obviously, you've seen the headlines around fish discos and protections. I mean, I'm just going to quote from the report. There's a great bit here where you talk about Natural England designating part of Cornwall, part of the coast there, as a special protection area because 15 Slavonian birds winter there. You talk elsewhere in the report about the price that we are sort of implicitly putting on, things like bats and birds and our desire to protect them. Again, how on earth did we get to the point that we're protecting birds in this way and fish?
What I observed, a few things. First of all, I was very impressed with the environmental bodies, the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, Wildlife Trust and others, with the evidence they presented us on nature depletion. And it's a serious problem. So, I take that very, very seriously. But when you then look at how the system works, what it does is it creates all these incentives for these organizations to fight development in order to, and do an awful lot of measurement, in order to get species protected in sight. And in fact, in some cases we have enhancement, we have a 10% biodiversity net gain rules in the planning system. And in actual fact, if you stand back from that and ask yourself the question, all the money that goes into the measurement and all the money that goes into the argument about it, if you stood back and said, let's just put that money into nature restoration, what would happen?
You're saying at the moment, if you do a development, there has to be a biodiversity net gain.
There's a 10%, and it should be on the site. That's the gold standard.
Why is it on the site?
In a lot of cases that could be the right answer. So
right.
you're building new houses,
fine,
building in parkland, building in recreational space, creating a water area. These might be the right things to do. John Cunliffe in his review of the water sector made a similar point. But when we build a reservoir, after the reservoir is built, there's a huge biodiversity gain from the building of the reservoir because the birds, the water birds and other animals that benefit from a large body of water. But it's the net gain is in the building of it, not in the overall project by the end of it. So it ends up that you still have to mitigate all of the harm done during the building. So the rules of the system are set up in a way that I don't think gets the best outcome for nature always, or gets the best outcome for the taxpayer or the consumer in terms of building. So I think one of the things we need to think harder about, and we've pointed to ways of doing this, is trying to just get to an answer that gives more money to nature protection earlier in the system, and ask the question. So if you take the Hinckley salmon and Chad examples, if you started from the proposition, which I think is very justifiable, that salmon in the Severn are unique to the Severn and it's incredibly important that we protect them, what should we be doing to protect them? You might start with agricultural runoff. You might look at weirs and other obstacles to salmon getting upstream, et cetera, et cetera. And then you might say, well, what would 10 or 20 million do to improve that? And how would that compare with this intake, outtake, and acoustic deterrent? And you might come up with a very different answer. You might come up with an answer that says, actually 10 million is going to have an amazingly positive effect on salmon in the Severn. And so that's where I think we should be having the debate. And so the environmental organizations made the point to us, and again, a very compelling point. having that discussion at the start of the project is really important. Once the project gets going, it becomes more and more expensive to do it. And I think some of the organizations doing the building said, doing some of this protection off the nuclear site may be an awful lot more effective, because the nuclear site's an incredibly expensive place to be doing this, because everything on nuclear is just a bit more expensive.
I think it pays to just read out what your report says here about this fish scheme with Hinkley Point. In order to protect the fish, we spent 700 million. EDF had to catch the fish, anaesthetize them, inject them with a chip to follow their movements to avoid double counting, and people just can't believe that. So you're saying that the solution here was just take a smaller sum.
I mean, I don't know what the solution would have been, and one of the things I don't know is if we did a different solution, how much cheaper the intake would have been. But it is the most expensive intake in the world. But I think sometimes we should ask ourselves the question: is all of this measurement really, and spending money on this, as good as actually we have a problem with salmon protection in our rivers? What can we do to improve that? Mm-hmm. But the problem is that the people who are doing salmon protection upstream in the Severn are not the people who are necessarily going to be getting the money coming out of this. They don't. Let's say I'm a salmon protection charity and I'm trying to do salmon protection upstream in the Severn. I'm not going to get any of the money from EDF for doing that under the current rules. That's not how it works. So the only lever I have is to stop EDF from having any harm to the salmon downstream. And what I'd like us to do is have a debate about, well, wouldn't it be better to create a system in which you could say, actually, we can save several hundred salmon a year by doing things upstream in the Severn or other measures. So what we've said in the report is we'd like some more money to go to science and some more money to go to conservation and slightly less money to go to measurement. If we give them the money, if they want to spend the money on measurement and blocking things and so on, fine. But actually, let's try and spend the money on proactive nature enhancement. And I was listening to somebody, another environmental campaigner on the radio this morning saying, we're spending an awful lot of money on this, and we're still not getting it right. So I think just a wider debate about how can we do nature protection better than having it block development, because I'm not sure the trade-off is where it should be. And
given the depletion that we're seeing in
we're seeing huge depletion.
Yeah.
And the answer, let's make development, and this is not just nuclear, but let's make development more and more expensive, might not be the right answer. We might need to think about other things. And I say this as somebody who is quite passionate about nature conservation and the environment as well. So I just think we need to think, how do we move away from a system that has created this really hard and expensive trade-off, when in actual fact, if you step back from it, the trade-off may not be there.
I think the thing that frustrates people so much is we obviously would act so much quicker if we were under threat, if we were in war.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine, but then we had COVID and we saw how quickly the state can react when they have to react. If we were on a sort of war footing here or a COVID footing and we had to solve this problem, it wouldn't have to take 2.5 years even. Yeah. So, I mean, why don't we just, as a country, learn from what we did in COVID and respond to something like this with the speed of a nation under attack, essentially?
I mean, it's a great question. But I don't think it's how government works now. There's just too many stakeholders, too many interests for politicians just to come along and say, we're going to do this in this way. I think what you can do is, if you commit to doing something on a reasonably tight time scale, and some of this requires primary legislation, and if you can commit to do it, and then you can show at each step of the way that you're doing it on schedule, actually, what it does is it crowds in investment. Because if you're a tech company thinking of investing in, say, a quantum computing facility or an AI facility, and you're thinking, we're going to dig foundations, and but we're going to need energy in 2031 to power this thing. Okay, you don't need the energy now. What you need now is a credible commitment for the government that that's going to happen in 2031. And the way the government credibly commits to that is by implementing quickly and by showing at each step of the way that it's going along. And so to my mind, one of the measures of success, and we have a chapter at the end of the report on how we measure success, is actually that investment begins to flow now. And just like with the third runway or whatever it happens to be, if the government makes a decision that shows it's prepared to do something and take on vested interests and put the future above the present, and so it's going to crowd in investment earlier. It's going to send a vote of confidence.
But we have with HS2 something a bit like that, and then so much of it has been scuppered. I mean, so things can still be undone, of course.
Things can still be undone. I think, we're sort of in last chance saloon on getting some of this stuff right, and this is a good test case. The nuclear estate is small, it's 6,000 acres, so not a big part of the country. It's a really great place for us to pilot doing some properly innovative stuff on how we do regulation, how we do planning, how we do environment, because it's not all infrastructure, it's only affecting a small part of the country. But the impact it has on consumer bills, on competitiveness, on other things, on the deterrent is absolutely enormous. So it's an area where you can really demonstrate a new approach to doing these
Tip
things.
of the spear.
Yeah, and so that's now with political leaders and civil servants to do. But
this is the bit where I think people will get frustrated. They'll think, well, why can't John go and run the group that then controls this implementation across government?
John might have other things he wants to do in his life.
John needs to serve the country.
John has to earn a living.
But what I mean is, why isn't you talk about an implementation group? Shouldn't there be a czar? Don't we need a sort of a Groves or what have you?
I mean, I think we have we have ministers like Patrick Vallance, who have a strong track record in delivering things. Who's the energy minister who, and with Ed Miliband, will be delivering some of this. John Healey.
But it's like the Kate Bingham situation with the vaccines. I mean, don't you need to put someone in charge?
But I think the Kate Bingham situation with the vaccines, I mean...
It's not analogous.
It is not analogous because we are not at war footing. And you can describe there are 4,000 people a year die from fuel poverty, and that's a really important issue. But this is about getting something right for the long term. And it's about bringing people with you to do that, because you need to have. I mean, I was really surprised at how strong the public reaction has been to this, and I've also been really pleasantly surprised with how strongly positive the reaction is from people I know in their 20s and teens. I have several godchildren, and all of them are saying to me, "Oh, we're big fans of nuclear," and then I've had people in their 70s who've said to me, I was a huge fan of nuclear in the 70s. I don't know why we stopped doing it. I'm really pleased you're doing this. So across the generations and across many different groups, there's a real appetite for getting nuclear right. There are people who are concerned with it, and there are people who are concerned with environmental and planning issues. But at the end of the day, I get the sense there's a strong public appetite for change in this space.
Final question is just, does solar and wind crowd out a focus on nuclear? Did you see them as competitive? Obviously, solar takes up a great deal more space than nuclear to produce the same energy.
We didn't, in the report or as a task force, see it as our role to take a view on whether nuclear is a good thing or a bad thing.
Right.
That's a decision for the government, and we are not advocates for or against nuclear in any sense.
Just
our task was, if you want to do it, how do you do it well?
Right.
But in looking at that, you obviously look at the fact that one of the things new nuclear power stations can do now is that they can increase and reduce the output on a very short time scale, which is what we use gas for at the moment. And probably when I started this, I'd heard about nuclear as producing baseload, like produces, a nuclear power station produces a gigawatt of energy constantly for 50 years. But actually, if it can vary like that, it suddenly makes it a much more appealing prospect for dealing with, for enabling us to move away from gas in the long term. And so,
because the problem with renewables is they're intermittent.
Yeah, and also energy demand fluctuates hugely throughout the day. So,
right.
The sun mightn't be shining at the time everybody turns their washing machines on or charges their cars.
Like nuclear.
So you need something like that. Now you have many other levers to manage demand, and you also, for stability of the system, having large rotating turbines turns out to be a really important complement to nuclear. You also have the fact that the challenge. If you look at what's happened with solar and wind, cost of solar has gone down hugely. But actually, you look at the graphs of the amount of sunshine we get in the UK compared with Spain, we're never going to have as much solar energy in the UK as we have in other countries. I think one of the energy companies in the UK is now building solar power in Morocco and piping it up to the UK. At least I read that yesterday. And then with wind, the cost of wind has not come down the way the cost of solar has. And wind is highly correlated. So if it's windy in the UK, it might be windy in France. But if it's not, it's not. So interconnectors may be less useful on dealing with intermittency or with variability in wind. So I'm not saying that solar and wind are not great, but we just need to be realistic about the relative costs. If we can bring the cost of nuclear down, I think it'll make the sustainability of a lot of what we're doing on wind and solar clearer. It might also mean we don't need quite the same mix, or we can do it in different ways. And I think there'll be other innovations. Battery storage could improve at the moment. Battery storage is very land intensive. Mm-hmm. And so there's an environmental cost associated with that that people need to think about when they say battery storage is the way forward. It has an environmental cost as well. So we need to be looking holistically at all of that.